Imagine you're out in the middle of the ocean, surrounded by nothing but black water and silence. You think you're alone. You think that whatever happens out there stays between you and the waves. But while Brian Hooker was telling the world a story about a tragic accident and a 9-hour struggle to survive, something was watching him from 200 miles above. A commercial satellite, part of a global tracking network that never sleeps, was recording every single move of the yacht Soulmate. It wasn't just a witness, it was a digital ghost that Brian didn't know existed. And what that satellite saw, every turn, every speed change, every second of that night, doesn't just challenge Brian's story, it completely destroys it. I've spent hours digging through the technical architecture of this tracking system and the newly leaked maps Brian himself sent to his friends. And honestly, what the data shows compared to what Brian said happened, it's not just a small mistake. It's a massive, chilling contradiction that changes everything we thought we knew about Lynette's final moments. Before we get into the laptops and the phones the FBI just seized, or that bizarre moment Brian went overboard in handcuffs while the police were boarding his boat, we have to talk about the data that cannot be deleted and cannot be faked. Because the ocean might not have a voice, but the satellites do. And they're finally starting to speak. The thing you have to understand about the ocean in 2026 is that it's not the wild, untraceable frontier it used to be. Brian Hooker told the Royal Bahamas Police that on the night of April 4th, he was a victim of circumstance. He claimed the engine on the dinghy died. The wind ripped him away from his wife, and he spent 9 agonizing hours paddling through the dark, just trying to reach land. It's a survival story that sounds heroic on paper, but there is one massive digital problem that Brian seemingly forgot about. It's called AIS, the Automatic Identification System. Think of it like a digital breadcrumb trail that every major vessel leaves behind. Every few seconds, the yacht Soulmate was broadcasting its exact location, its speed, and even its heading to anyone with a receiver. We're talking about shore stations, other boats in the area, and a network of satellites orbiting the Earth. This isn't like a cell phone signal that can drop out or a GPS that you can just turn off and hope for the best. This is a continuous, hard-coded broadcast. And this is where the story starts to fall apart in a really disturbing way. Lynette's daughter, Carly, has been working with investigators, and she's brought something to light that should make everyone's skin crawl. According to her, the AIS data from that night shows that the Soulmate, the big yacht, the one Brian said he wasn't on, was actually moving during the exact window of time he claimed to be drifting helplessly in a tiny rubber dinghy. Now just think about that for a second. If Brian is in a dinghy, miles away, struggling to survive, then who is moving the yacht? A boat of that size doesn't just decide to go for a cruise on its own. It requires a hand at the helm. It requires someone to start the engines and navigate. If the data shows that boat was in motion, it means Brian's entire timeline of being lost at sea isn't just a misunderstanding, it's a calculated fabrication. But it gets even deeper. See, the AIS data is recorded on servers that are owned by independent companies all over the world. Brian can't call them up and ask them to delete a few hours of data. He can't claim the file got corrupted. It's archived in multiple places simultaneously. It's the kind of evidence that trial lawyers call a silent witness. And as one legal expert put it, this kind of data is absolutely terrifying for a defense team. Why? Because you can't argue with a satellite. You can't tell a jury that the satellite had a personal grudge or that it misremembered the time. And what's truly chilling is the granularity of this record. We aren't just talking about a dot on a map. We're talking about a second-by-second breakdown. We can see exactly when the boat started moving, how fast it was going, and where it stopped. If Brian was using that yacht to dispose of evidence or to reposition himself before making his miraculous appearance at Marsh Harbor, every single turn is etched into a server somewhere in the cloud. The investigation isn't just looking at the facts anymore, they're looking at the math. They're comparing the speed of a man paddling a dinghy against the digital pings of a high-powered yacht. And the two stories aren't just different. They're from two completely different worlds. Brian claimed he was a man at the mercy of the sea, but the satellites might just prove he was a man in total control, navigating through the dark while the world thought he was fighting for his life. But as shocking as the satellite data is, it's not the only thing that caught the investigators' attention. Because while the digital ghost of the Soulmate was telling one story, Brian's own physical behavior was starting to tell another. And it all came to a head during a chaotic moment on the deck of that very boat, a moment involving a pair of handcuffs and a sudden splash that left everyone wondering if Brian was truly a victim or just a very dedicated actor. The satellite data is cold and mechanical, but what happened on April 8th was pure, unfiltered drama. This is the day the investigation shifted from a missing persons case into something much more intense. The police didn't just show up to the Soulmate to ask a few more questions, they showed up with a judicial warrant to seize every piece of digital life Brian had left on that boat. We're talking laptops, tablets, and phones. And what happened during that boarding is one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen in a case like this. Picture this. Brian Hooker is back on his yacht, the same boat where he says he spent so many happy years with Lynette, but this time he's in handcuffs. The Royal Bahamas police are all over the deck, bagging evidence, while the water around the boat is getting rough and choppy. And then, in a split second, Brian, a man who had just supposedly survived 9 hours of paddling through a literal storm, loses his balance and goes right over the side. He hits the water, still handcuffed, and the police have to scramble to haul him back up. His lawyer later claimed the conditions were dangerous and that Brian ended up with a pretty nasty knee injury from the fall. But when you step back and look at the human side of this, something feels off. This is a man who just 4 days earlier claimed to have the physical endurance of an Olympic athlete. He told everyone he paddled a tiny rubber boat through miles of open, dark, turbulent sea. If he had the strength and the balance to survive that, how does he just slip off the deck of his own familiar yacht the moment the police start looking at his hard drives? It's a massive contradiction that the investigators definitely noted. Either the sea on the night Lynette disappeared wasn't nearly as rough as he claimed, or Brian isn't as physically capable as he wants us to believe. You can't have it both ways. You can't be a seafaring survivor one day and a fragile victim who can't stand on a deck the next. It felt less like an accident and more like a distraction, or maybe just the physical manifestation of a man who was finally starting to crack under the pressure of his own story. And that knee injury, it became his ticket out of the immediate line of fire. He was taken to the hospital, treated, and it bought him time. But time was the one thing Brian didn't really have, because while he was sitting in a hospital bed or a jail cell, the digital forensics team was starting to crack open those laptops. And what people often forget is that your phone and your computer are basically black boxes of your soul. Think about your own search history or the private messages you send when you think no one is looking. Now imagine you're in the middle of a high-stakes investigation. The police were looking for everything. Did he search for how to disable AIS? Did he look up tide patterns in the Abaco Islands before the trip? Did he message someone in Sacramento saying he'd be home sooner than expected? The warrant itself tells us that a judge saw enough probable cause to believe that the evidence of a crime was hidden inside those circuits. You don't get a warrant to seize a man's digital life just because his wife is missing. You get it because there's a gap in the story that only data can fill. And while Brian was busy falling into the water and complaining about his knee, the FBI was quietly stepping into the background, ready to take those devices back to a lab where no amount of accidental falls could stop the truth from coming out. It makes you wonder, was he actually losing his balance, or was he losing his grip on the narrative? Because as we're about to see, the maps Brian was showing to his friends weren't exactly matching up with the reality of the ocean. He was trying to draw a picture of a hero, but the ink was starting to run. While the digital satellites were watching from above and the police were wrestling Brian back onto the boat, another piece of evidence was quietly circulating, and this one came directly from Brian's own hand. You see, after the incident, Brian wasn't just talking to the police. He was messaging his friends, trying to explain the unexplainable. And in those messages, he sent something that he probably thought would clear his name: screenshots of Navionics maps. Now, if you aren't a boater, Navionics is basically the gold standard for maritime navigation. It's an app that shows you depth, currents, and exactly where your boat has traveled. Brian sent these annotated maps to his close friends, showing a red line that traced his supposed path from the yacht Soulmate all the way to Marsh Harbor. He was basically saying, look, here is the proof of my struggle. Here is exactly where I paddled for 9 hours. But there is a massive difference between drawing a line on a map and actually surviving that journey in the physical world. When forensic experts and local Bahamian sailors started looking at those maps, the red flags didn't just pop up, they caught fire. Brian's map showed him moving in a relatively straight, logical line towards safety. But the ocean doesn't work in straight lines, especially not in the Sea of Abaco at night. On the night Lynette disappeared, the tides were shifting and the currents in that area are notorious for being unpredictable. If you're in a tiny 8-foot rubber dinghy with nothing but a plastic paddle, you are at the total mercy of the water. If the current is pulling south and you're trying to go west, you aren't going to move in a straight line. You're going to drift. You're going to fight for every inch. Yet Brian's proof looked like a clean, calculated commute. It looked like a path made by someone who knew exactly where they wanted the story to end, not someone who was fighting for their life in a panic. And here's the kicker. The timing on those maps just doesn't add up with the physics of human endurance. To cover the distance Brian claimed he covered in the time he said it took, he would have had to be paddling at a speed that is almost physically impossible for a man of his age, especially under that kind of emotional and physical stress. It's like claiming you ran a marathon in record time while wearing combat boots and carrying a backpack. It just doesn't pass the smell test. Local captains who have spent 40 years in those waters looked at his coordinates and basically shook their heads. They know that if he had truly been drifting where he said he was, the current would have pushed him toward the shallow reefs or out into the open sounds, not perfectly into the boatyard at Marsh Harbor. It's almost as if Brian sat down with his iPad and designed a route that made him look like a hero, forgetting that the ocean leaves its own record that you can't just draw over with a digital pen. This is the danger of trying to be too perfect when you're telling a lie. A real survivor's story is messy. It's full of gaps. It's full of, I don't know how I got here, or I lost track of time. But Brian's story was too clinical. Every map, every screenshot, every explanation felt like it had been scrubbed and polished for a jury. The investigators started asking the real question. Why would a man who just lost his wife be so obsessed with proving his GPS coordinates to his friends? Usually when you're grieving, you aren't worried about your Navionics settings. You're worried about the person who isn't standing next to you anymore. But Brian was focused on the map. He was focused on the line. He was focused on making sure everyone believed the where and the how, because he knew if anyone looked too closely at the why, the whole thing would fall apart. And while he was busy defending his map, a new voice was about to enter the conversation. Lynette's daughter, Carly. She wasn't looking at GPS pings or tidal charts. She was looking at the man her mother had married, and she was ready to tell the world about the side of Brian Hooker that the satellites and the maps could never show. You know, up until this point, we've been looking at data, satellites, maps, and GPS pings, but data only tells you what happened. It doesn't tell you who these people were when the cameras weren't rolling. And that's where things get really dark. Lynette's daughter, Carly, finally broke the silence, and she didn't just talk about the night of the disappearance. She talked about the months leading up to it. And according to her, the perfect couple image we saw on social media, it was a total lie. Carly dropped a bombshell that changes the entire motive of this case. She revealed that for years, Brian and Lynette had been living a sober life. They had committed to it together. But when they got to Key West, right before heading into the Bahamas, something shifted. The sobriety ended. And when the alcohol came back into the picture, so did the old demons. Carly described a marriage that was starting to fracture under the weight of some really ugly arguments. We aren't talking about small disagreements over dinner. We're talking about deep, fundamental cracks. She hinted that Brian couldn't handle Lynette's strength, her greatness, as some viewers have called it. When they were out on that boat, isolated in the middle of the ocean, there was no one to act as a buffer, no one to call for help. Just two people, a lot of history, and a sudden return to a lifestyle that had caused them problems in the past. Think about the bartender's testimony at the Abaco Inn. He remembered them having Cuba Libre, rum and cokes. On the surface, it's just a couple having a drink on vacation. But through the lens of Carly's revelation, those drinks were a massive red flag. If they were supposed to be sober and they were back to drinking, the tension on that yacht must have been sky high. Alcohol doesn't just change your behavior, it changes your decision-making. It turns small sparks into forest fires. And this is where the why starts to make sense. If things were falling apart behind closed doors, if the resentment was building up day after day while they were trapped on that boat together, then the accidental fall into the water starts to look a lot more like a final solution to a problem Brian didn't know how to fix. Carly's account suggests that Brian's calm demeanor after Lynette went missing wasn't shock. It was the behavior of a man who was finally relieved. It makes you look at his actions the next day differently too. Usually when a tragedy happens, you lean on family. You call the children. You stay and search until your hands bleed. But Brian, he didn't do that. He was focused on his boat. He was focused on getting his flight back to Sacramento. It's like he was trying to outrun the ghost of his marriage before the authorities could start asking about what really happened in the weeks leading up to April 4th. Carly isn't just a grieving daughter, she's a witness to the reality of their life. She's the one who knows what Brian's temper looked like. She knows what he was capable of when the masks came off. And her testimony is the reason the FBI didn't just walk away when the Bahamian police released Brian without charges. They realized that this wasn't just a maritime accident, it was the climax of a much longer, much more violent story. The satellites showed us where the boat was, but Carly showed us where Brian's head was. And when you combine the two, the picture that emerges is terrifying. It's the story of a man who thought he could use the vastness of the ocean to bury his secrets, not realizing that the people he left behind knew exactly where to look. But there's one final piece to this puzzle. Because while Carly was talking, the FBI was working. They weren't just looking at the drinking or the arguments. They were looking at the one thing Brian thought he had successfully moved out of reach, his digital footprint. And what they found on those seized devices is what finally brings this whole story home. So, we've looked at the satellites, the weird behavior on the boat, and the reality of their marriage. But here is the part that should really keep you up at night. Brian Hooker was released. He walked out of that Bohemian jail, got on a plane, and headed back to Sacramento. To the rest of the world, it looked like he got away with it. People were furious. They were calling it a failure of justice. But what Brian didn't realize is that released does not mean cleared. The Royal Bahamas Police used a very specific phrase when they let him go, pending further investigation. That isn't just legal talk. It's a warning. In the world of high-stakes forensics, the clock doesn't stop just because a suspect is on a plane. In fact, that's when the real work begins. Because while Brian was trying to settle back into his life in California, the FBI and the U.S. Coast Guard were performing a digital autopsy on every device they took from the Soulmate. And this is where the U.S. Special Maritime Jurisdiction comes into play. Since Lynette is an American citizen and this happened on a U.S. registered vessel, the FBI has the power to bring federal charges regardless of what happens in the Bahamas. They aren't just looking for a smoking gun, they are looking for the digital video recorder data and the search history that Brian thought was private. Think about it. If you're planning something or if you're trying to cover something up, you're going to search for it. You're going to look for how to reset AIS, or how long does a body stay afloat, or legal jurisdiction in international waters. You might delete the history, but the FBI doesn't care about what you deleted. They care about what's left in the metadata. They care about the fragments of files that prove you were thinking about these things days, weeks, or even months before the trip began. And then there are the phones. Every time your phone connects to a network or even just tries to find a GPS signal, it creates a log. If Brian's phone shows activity at 2 a.m. while he's supposedly paddling for his life in a dinghy, the case is over. If there are messages to people back in Sacramento that contradict what he told the police in Marsh Harbor, he's done. The FBI is notoriously patient. They don't rush to charge someone just to make a headline. They wait until they have a mountain of evidence so high that no defense lawyer in the world can climb over it. The most chilling part of all this is that Brian is currently living in the quiet before the storm. He's back in his home, maybe thinking the worst is over. But every day, a forensic analyst is sitting in a lab, going through thousands of lines of data, connecting the pings from the satellites to the pings from his phone. They are building a timeline that is so precise it will account for every second of that night. The investigation is active. It is moving. And the language of pending results suggests that they are just waiting for that one final forensic report, maybe a pathology report or a recovered file, to pull the trigger. Brian Hooker might have left the islands behind, but he couldn't leave the data. And in 2026, the data is the only witness that never blinks and never forgets. We've covered the satellite trap, the physical drama, the lies on the maps, and the truth about their marriage. Now all eyes are on the FBI. Because when they finally move, it won't be a maybe or a supposedly. It will be the final word on what really happened to Lynette Hooker.